Things aren't looking good for Pastor Kenneth Copeland. He told the world he would never catch COVID because of his faith. 2 years later, he was rushed into emergency surgery fighting for his life. He promised God gave him a personal deal to live to 120. Meanwhile, his own family has buried a great-grandson and a daughter-in-law in near silence. For over 50 years, Kenneth Copeland has been one of the most powerful names in television ministry, a man who built private runways, a fleet of jets, and a fortune on the promise that faith alone could heal any sickness and multiply any bank account. But behind the pulpit, the cameras, and the carefully managed interviews, something appears to be shifting. Today we're looking at the health scares, the family tragedies, the quiet leadership handoff, and the decades of controversy that have followed Kenneth Copeland, and asking the question almost nobody inside his ministry wants to say out loud. What happens when the man who claims he won't really die finally does? Kenneth Copeland has spent more than 5 decades teaching that sickness has no place in the life of a true believer. He built an entire ministry, an entire media empire, around the idea that faith spoken boldly enough can override doctors, diagnoses, and even death itself. So it raised eyebrows in May of 2024 when Copeland suffered a ruptured appendix and had to be rushed into emergency surgery. He ended up spending nearly 10 days in the hospital across 2 separate admissions. This is a man who spent decades telling his television audience that they didn't need a doctor if their faith was strong enough, now relying on modern surgery to survive a medical emergency. It's worth remembering that this hospitalization came less than 2 years after Copeland stood in front of his congregation on Christmas Eve of 2022 and confidently declared that he personally would never get any version of COVID because he lived by faith. Millions of people heard him say it. Then, in 2024, faith didn't keep him out of a Texas operating room. When Copeland eventually returned to preaching, he handled the topic with humor rather than reflection. He told his congregation that while he was under anesthesia, he had been singing love songs to his wife, Gloria, and quoting verses from the book of Hebrews. The crowd laughed politely. But underneath the light-hearted retelling was a simple, universal truth that no amount of theology can erase. The body ages, and it eventually fails, no matter how much faith a person claims to have. For a ministry built on the promise of supernatural healing, a medical emergency requiring an operating room is not a small detail. It's a crack in the foundation. Then, in March of 2026, something happened that hadn't happened in more than 15 years. Kenneth Copeland sat down for a genuine long-form, one-on-one interview. It ran over 2 hours, hosted by evangelical podcaster Bryce Crawford. On the surface, this looked like Copeland opening up after years of guarded silence. But look closer at who is asking the questions. Crawford is a friendly, faith-affirming podcaster, not an investigative journalist. And notably, Copeland has still not agreed to sit down again with Inside Edition, the outlet that once cornered him with much tougher, more uncomfortable questions. When a public figure who avoided interviews for over a decade suddenly grants access, but only to interviewers who won't challenge him, that's not necessarily transparency. It can just as easily be a carefully managed public relations strategy. And while Copeland was doing the media rounds, something more important was happening quietly behind the scenes, a leadership shakeup at Kenneth Copeland Ministries. His son, John Copeland, has returned to a top executive role. John had originally stepped down as chief operating officer back in 2018 following a highly publicized divorce, and for years afterward, he was only listed as a consultant, seemingly on the outside looking in. But according to the watchdog group Ministry Watch, by 2025 and into 2026, John Copeland was back, this time as the ministry's chief executive officer. His return puts control of the organization firmly back in the hands of the immediate family at a moment when questions about succession are only getting louder. Through all of this, Copeland has continued to repeat one of his most famous personal claims, that he has a private agreement with God allowing him to live to the age of 120, all the way to the year 2056. Every birthday that passes, this claim gets a little more attention and a little more scrutiny. In December of 2025, Kenneth Copeland turned 89 years old. He's still preaching. He's still active. But an 89-year-old man who has already had emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix is not exactly a picture of the supernatural immunity to aging that he's promised his followers for decades. Behind the public claims of divine protection, the Copeland family has also endured real, painful loss, the kind that faith declarations apparently couldn't prevent. In May of 2021, Kenneth and Gloria Copeland's great-grandson, Clark Meyer, drowned. It was a devastating loss made even more painful by the fact that this is a family that has spent generations teaching that speaking positive, faith-filled words over loved ones brings supernatural protection. And yet, the ministry handled the tragedy with almost total silence. There was no nationally broadcast memorial. There was no Sunday message trying to explain how this fit within the ministry's theology. For an organization built entirely around the power of spoken words, the near-total quiet around a child's death struck many observers as telling. Then, in 2023, the family faced another loss, the death of Marty Copeland, who had once been the public face of the ministry's health and fitness outreach, encouraging followers to honor God by taking care of their physical bodies. By the time she passed away, she and John Copeland had already been divorced for about 5 years. Kenneth Copeland Ministries did not send out a formal statement to its donor base about her death, and it received very little coverage anywhere else either. Once again, many people were left asking uncomfortable questions about how a ministry so focused on healing and physical wellness handles loss within its own family. Even before these losses, there were signs of strain running through the Copeland family. John Copeland's 2018 divorce didn't just affect his personal life. It also derailed his position as the presumed heir to the ministry, pushing him out of leadership for years before his eventual return. His sister, Kelly Copeland, known within the ministry as Commander Kelly through the Super Kid Academy children's program, has also gone through more than one marriage. And looking back further, Kenneth Copeland himself had 2 failed marriages before he married Gloria, a detail that notably does not appear anywhere on the ministry's official biography page. Personal struggles are one thing, but Kenneth Copeland has also spent years facing hard questions about money, and one of the most uncomfortable public confrontations of his career came in 2019, when Inside Edition correspondent Lisa Guerrero tracked him down at a small private airfield in Branson, Missouri. She was there investigating the growing fleet of private jets Kenneth Copeland Ministries had built up over the years using donor contributions. At that point, the ministry's aircraft included a Cessna Citation Bravo, a Cessna Citation X, and a Gulfstream 5 that Copeland had personally purchased from filmmaker Tyler Perry. According to reporting from the Christian Post, on top of already owning that Gulfstream, the ministry was also asking supporters for an additional $19.5 million to fund aircraft upgrades and build a brand new hangar, a request aimed at everyday working-class donors who had been told that giving sacrificially, even their last paycheck, could bring them a 100-fold blessing in return. This wasn't the first time Copeland's views on air travel had made headlines. Years earlier, he appeared on his own broadcast alongside fellow televangelist Jesse Duplantis and explained why he believed he couldn't fly commercial. He said getting into what he called a long tube with a bunch of demons was dangerous, and Duplantis laughed along in agreement. So when Lisa Guerrero confronted him about those exact comments at the airfield, Copeland flatly denied ever saying them, telling her not to claim that he had, even though the original footage was already public and had been broadcast by his own ministry. When Guerrero pressed him about spending donor money on a private jet, Copeland told her it was none of her business, and at another point in the exchange, he called her sweetheart and baby and tried to take her hand to pray for her instead of answering the question. It became one of the most talked-about moments of his public career, not because of what he said, but because of what he refused to say. That same pattern, responding to hard questions with spiritual authority instead of a straight answer, showed up again during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. On March 29, 2020, Copeland appeared on camera, held out his hand toward the screen, and declared that he was personally executing judgment against the coronavirus, while also demanding that a vaccine be produced immediately. A few days later, he appeared again, this time blowing air toward the camera and claiming his breath was destroying the virus. His wife, Gloria Copeland, had made her own headlines 2 years earlier, during one of the deadliest flu seasons in nearly a decade, when she told viewers that flu season is not real and that Jesus had already provided the flu shot. The CDC later estimated that roughly 52,000 Americans died during that same flu season. Because the Copelands reach such a massive national audience, statements like these drew serious criticism from people who felt the couple was discouraging their followers from trusting basic medical care. Long before the pandemic, Kenneth Copeland was already a target of official scrutiny. In November of 2007, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, then the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, sent formal inquiry letters to 6 of the country's best-known televangelists, including Copeland, Benny Hinn, Joyce Meyer, Creflo Dollar, Eddie Long, and Paula and Randy White. Grassley wanted basic financial transparency: who sat on each ministry's board, what executives were being paid, how much private jets cost, and where financial records were kept. 3 of the 6 ministries cooperated. Copeland was among the 3 that did not. The official response, issued through Eagle Mountain International Church, the legal organization behind much of Copeland's ministry, stated that the church had cooperated as much as it could without violating constitutional privacy and association rights, in practice, refusing to name the 10 people who sat on its own board, even to a sitting United States senator. When the Senate investigation finally wrapped up in January 2011, it revealed that the Copeland family's parsonage outside Fort Worth was an 18,000-square-foot mansion, appraised at $6.4 million and sitting on 25 acres of land. But according to many longtime critics, the financial controversies are really just a symptom of something bigger: the theology underneath them. Kenneth Copeland has long been one of the most recognizable faces of what's known as the Word of Faith movement, a strain of Christian teaching that reaches millions through television, books, and conferences. But many respected Christian leaders have questioned exactly where this theology came from and whether it holds up biblically. Its roots trace back to a writer named E.W. Kenyon, who died in 1948 and wrote extensively about faith, healing, and spiritual authority. Preacher Kenneth Hagin Sr. drew heavily from Kenyon's writing and became one of the movement's leading teachers, eventually mentoring a young Kenneth Copeland in the late 1960s, after Copeland had already spent time working as televangelist Oral Roberts' personal pilot. Costi Hinn, the nephew of Benny Hinn and a former insider in this same network of ministries, has since left the movement and written publicly about its origins. In his book, Hinn argues that much of the movement's theological system rests on Hagin's use of material lifted from Kenyon, going as far as to call it plagiarism. For critics, that raises a serious question. If the foundation of the teaching itself is built on borrowed and possibly uncredited material, how solid is everything built on top of it? 2 specific teachings have drawn the sharpest criticism over the decades. The first is often called the Little Gods doctrine. In a 1987 broadcast of Believer's Voice of Victory, Copeland stated that whenever he reads the Bible and sees God say, "I am," he smiles and says he is too, and in one of his published books he wrote that Adam wasn't just a little like God, but was exactly like God. Prominent pastor and theologian John MacArthur has called this teaching an entirely different gospel altogether. Hank Hanegraaff, widely known as the Bible Answer Man, went even further in his book Christianity in Crisis, arguing that Kenneth Copeland Ministries shows the characteristics of a cult. The second heavily criticized teaching involves what Copeland says happened after Jesus died on the cross. Rather than teaching that Christ's death alone was sufficient for salvation, Copeland has taught that Jesus descended into hell after the crucifixion, was tortured there by Satan, and was born again in hell before defeating the devil. Respected theologian R.C. Sproul and speaker Justin Peters have both been vocal critics of this teaching, arguing it presents a fundamentally different understanding of Jesus than what's taught in Scripture. According to critics, these 2 beliefs aren't just theological curiosities. They argue that once someone accepts the idea that believers are essentially little gods whose spoken words carry supernatural power, it becomes a much smaller step to accept that giving money is itself a spiritual act capable of triggering a 100-fold financial return from heaven, which is exactly the kind of giving the ministry has spent decades encouraging. So, where does all of this leave Kenneth Copeland Ministries today? quietly but noticeably smaller. The flagship program Believer's Voice of Victory stopped airing on the Trinity Broadcasting Network back in October of 2020. Conferences that once ran nearly a full week have been condensed into much shorter events. The ministry's private airport in Tarrant County, Texas, once a symbol of just how far the organization had grown, is now down to a single usable runway. In 2021, the appraised value of the Copeland parsonage dropped by nearly $4 million, a change the watchdog group Trinity Foundation publicly called highly suspicious. Today, Ministry Watch gives Kenneth Copeland Ministries a transparency grade of F, along with a donor confidence score of just 10 out of 100, and the organization's official recommendation to potential donors is just 2 words: withhold giving. Ministry Watch also reports that more than 20 members of the Copeland family have drawn paychecks from the ministry over the years. At the same time, the signs of a leadership transition are becoming harder to miss. As of 2025, John Copeland holds the CEO title. His older sister, Terry Copeland Pearsons, already the senior pastor of Eagle Mountain International Church, has now also been given the title of Chief Visionary Officer for the entire ministry. Gloria Copeland appears on broadcasts far less often than she used to, and the ministry's social media has quietly started framing her in more reflective, honorific language, thanking her for decades of service rather than promoting her current activity, the kind of tone organizations often adopt when they're gently preparing an audience for a farewell. And Copeland himself has become far more selective about who gets to interview him, generally sticking to friendly podcastists rather than journalists willing to ask hard questions. It's also worth zooming out. Kenneth Copeland is far from the only major figure in the prosperity gospel movement to teach that faith could override the realities of aging and illness. Oral Roberts died at 91. Kenneth Hagin Sr. died at 86. Trinity Broadcasting Network founder Paul Crouch died in 2013. Eddie Long died of cancer in 2016. Every single one of them led ministries that emphasized healing through faith, and not one of them came anywhere close to the kind of extraordinary lifespan Copeland has promised himself. That history doesn't prove anything about what will happen to Copeland personally, but it does add real weight to the questions so many people are now asking. Kenneth Copeland is still preaching. His ministry is still operating, and its broadcasts are still reaching audiences around the world. But taken together, the hospitalizations, the family tragedies handled in near silence, the carefully managed interviews, the shrinking physical footprint of the ministry, the failing transparency grades, and the very deliberate handoff of leadership titles to his children, it's hard to ignore that this organization looks like it's preparing for a future without its founder, whether or not that's ever said outright from the stage. The generation of donors who built this ministry alongside Copeland is aging right along with him, which only adds another layer of uncertainty about what the organization looks like a decade from now. The real question was never really about jets or mansions or even the theology, as important as all of that is. The real question is much simpler. Can an organization built almost entirely around one man's voice, one man's promises, and one man's personal claim on longevity actually survive without him? For now, nobody inside the ministry seems willing to answer that question out loud. But the changes happening behind the scenes are answering it anyway.